The estate appraiser barely glanced at the battered red toolbox before sliding it aside with the tip of his shoe. "Old hand tools," he said, making a quick note on his clipboard. "Minimal resale value." Around him, family members carefully discussed antique furniture, silver serving trays, and Grandpa Samuel Carter's collection of vintage clocks. Those things, they agreed, would help settle the estate. The toolbox was simply taking up space in the workshop. Helen Carter stood quietly in the doorway, her hands folded tightly against her sweater. At 79, she had watched her late husband's workshop remain exactly as he left it for nearly 2 years. Every hammer still hung from its peg. Every plane rested on the same shelf. Even the scent of cedar and machine oil lingered in the cool October air. She had dusted the room every Thursday without moving a single tool more than an inch. Now bright inventory stickers appeared on workbenches that had once held children's birdhouses, repaired rocking chairs, and handmade Christmas toys. "We should probably auction all of this together," Ashley said, looking around the room. "Most people don't want old tools one piece at a time." Helen did not argue. She simply looked toward the scarred red toolbox resting beneath the workbench. Samuel had carried it into nearly every home in Oak Ridge at one time or another, repairing broken porch steps, loose railings, church pews, kitchen cabinets, and toys that families thought were beyond saving. The toolbox had never looked valuable. It had simply always been there. The appraiser bent down, lifted it onto the workbench, and flipped open the metal lid. Inside lay neatly arranged chisels, screwdrivers, measuring tools, and well-worn hammers, each polished by decades of careful hands. "Nothing unusual," he murmured. Then an older voice spoke from behind him. "Actually." Everyone turned. Frank Holloway, Samuel's longtime friend and former apprentice, had just stepped into the workshop carrying his hat in one hand. He walked slowly to the open toolbox, reached inside, and picked up an ordinary wooden-handled chisel. Holding it beneath the afternoon light, he gently brushed his thumb across the handle. Tiny engraved letters slowly became visible in the worn wood. They were not Samuel's initials. Frank looked at them for a long moment before quietly saying, "That's impossible." Ashley frowned. "What is?" Frank looked around the silent workshop, then back at the small engraving almost hidden beneath years of honest work. Sam never put his own name on his tools. He carefully lifted a second tool, different initials, then a third, different again. One by one, every handle carried someone else's letters. The room grew strangely quiet. For the first time that afternoon, no one was looking at the toolbox as a pile of worn-out tools. They were looking at a question that had been waiting inside plain sight for decades. Frank Holloway laid the chisel carefully back into the toolbox, then reached for an old block plane whose wooden handle had been polished smooth by countless hours of use. He turned it toward the window, where the afternoon sunlight revealed another pair of tiny engraved initials. J.R. he whispered with a faint smile. I haven't seen these letters in almost 50 years. Ashley crossed her arms. Maybe Grandpa loaned his tools to people. Frank gently shook his head. Sam loaned plenty of tools, but he never carved anyone's initials into them unless there was a reason. Helen stepped closer to the workbench. She had watched Samuel clean those tools every Saturday evening for decades, yet she had never once noticed the tiny engravings hidden beneath worn varnish and calloused fingerprints. He never mentioned them, she said softly. Frank smiled. That sounds exactly like him. One by one, they lifted the tools from the red metal box. A hammer carried the initials MC. A coping saw bore AW. A square showed DT. Every handle seemed to belong to someone different. There were no dates, no explanations, only careful engravings so small they almost disappeared into the grain of the wood. The appraiser quietly lowered his clipboard. I've inspected hundreds of estates, he admitted. I've never seen a toolbox marked like this. Frank picked up a measuring tape and ran his thumb across a faded blue paint mark near its edge. There's another thing, he murmured. Ashley frowned. Now what? The paint. She looked more closely. Tiny dots of faded color appeared on several tools. Some were blue, others green, yellow, or red. They looked random at first glance. Frank slowly smiled as though an old memory had just returned. I don't think they're random at all. Helen studied the markings. Did they separate different projects? Frank remained quiet for a moment before answering. Maybe. Or different people. Ashley sighed impatiently. They're still just old tools. Frank looked at her kindly rather than critically. That's exactly what I thought the first day I walked into this workshop when I was 23. His eyes drifted across the shelves where hand planes, clamps, and braces still rested exactly where Samuel had left them. Your grandfather never started by teaching people how to use a hammer. Ashley looked puzzled. Then, what did he teach? Frank chuckled softly. He taught us how not to be afraid of making mistakes. The room grew still. Helen remembered evenings when young neighbors stopped by after work carrying broken furniture or unfinished school projects. They rarely left quickly. Samuel always invited them inside the workshop, brewed a pot of coffee, and somehow turned a 15-minute repair into a 2-hour conversation. As a child, Ashley remembered waiting impatiently for her grandfather to finish talking. She had never realized the conversations were part of the work. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and removed a pair of reading glasses before examining another tool. His expression suddenly brightened. I know these initials, he said quietly. MC belongs to Michael Collins. Helen looked surprised. The retired firefighter? Frank nodded. Sam taught him to build wheelchair ramps after Michael injured his shoulder. He thought his useful days were over. He smiled warmly. Turns out he spent the next 30 years building ramps for other families. Ashley looked back at the hammer in silence. It no longer seemed like an ordinary tool. Somehow, a few tiny letters had given it a story. Before anyone could speak again, another truck pulled slowly into the driveway. An elderly man stepped out, carrying something wrapped carefully inside an old quilt. Frank watched him approach the workshop and quietly whispered, "If I'm right, we're about to find out those initials were never about ownership at all." The elderly man carried the quilt-wrapped bundle into Samuel Carter's workshop with the careful hands of someone protecting something that could never be replaced. He smiled gently at Helen before setting the bundle on the workbench beside the open toolbox. "I heard people were clearing out Sam's shop," he said. "I thought this belonged here today." Slowly, he folded back the quilt to reveal a beautifully restored oak rocking chair. Its arms were smooth from decades of use, but one leg was noticeably newer than the others, expertly matched so well that only a trained eye could see the repair. Frank's face immediately lit with recognition. "You still have it." The man nodded. "I almost didn't." He introduced himself to Ashley and the appraiser. "My name's Michael Collins." Ashley looked down at the hammer Frank had identified earlier. The initials MC? Michael smiled. "That's me." He rested one hand on the chair. 36 years ago, my little girl tipped this rocker over while climbing on it. I thought it was ruined." He laughed softly. "Sam told me broken wood isn't much different from broken confidence. Both can be repaired if someone believes they're worth the time." Michael looked around the workshop before continuing. I expected him to fix it himself. Instead, he handed me a hammer and spent 3 Saturdays teaching me how. Ashley glanced at the engraved hammer again. "This one?" Michael nodded. "Not on the first day. I earned that hammer after I finally stopped apologizing every time I hit a nail crooked." Gentle laughter filled the workshop. Frank reached into the toolbox and handed the hammer to Michael, who held it with unmistakable affection. "When Sam believed you'd learned more than woodworking," Michael explained, "he quietly carved your initials into the handle. It wasn't a gift. It was his way of saying you were ready to help someone else." The room fell silent. Helen slowly sat on Samuel's old stool. Remembering the evenings, her husband came inside with sawdust on his sleeves and a peaceful smile on his face. Whenever she asked how many projects he had finished that day, he almost never counted furniture. He counted people. Before anyone could speak, another pickup truck rolled into the driveway. Then another. Within half an hour, several older residents had gathered outside the workshop, each carrying something made, repaired, or restored many years earlier. One brought a cedar hope chest. Another carried a handmade birdhouse weathered by 20 winters. A retired teacher arrived with a child's wooden desk Samuel had helped rebuild after a basement flood. None of them came because someone invited them. They came because word had quietly spread that Samuel's tools were about to be sold. Inside the workshop, stories replaced silence. One man pointed toward a hand plane engraved with his initials and remembered learning patience after losing his factory job. A woman recognized a coping saw she had first used while building shelves for the public library. Another neighbor smiled through tears while describing the Christmas Eve Samuel taught local teenagers to repair broken toys so families in need could wake to something whole on Christmas morning. Ashley stood near the back wall, listening to story after story. She had entered the workshop expecting people to value the tools because they once belonged to her grandfather. Instead, they valued them because those tools had once belonged in a very different way to moments when frightened beginners discovered they were capable of creating something lasting with their own hands. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the worn wooden floor, Frank gently closed the lid of the red toolbox. "You see it now?" he asked quietly. Ashley looked at the engraved handles one last time before answering. "Every tool has a name." Frank smiled and slowly shook his head. "No," he said softly, "every tool has a student." By the following Saturday, the workshop no longer echoed with the sounds of an estate inventory. It echoed with conversation. People drifted in carrying repaired tables, handmade bookshelves, porch swings, toy wagons, and small wooden keepsakes they had built years earlier under Samuel Carter's patient instruction. Yet despite the growing crowd, bright auction stickers still clung to the workbenches, cabinets, and shelves. The sale had not been canceled. It had merely become harder to ignore what was being sold. Ashley stood near the doorway, reviewing paperwork with the estate representative. Every delay increased storage costs, insurance fees, and legal expenses. She listened respectfully to every story shared inside the workshop, but when she looked down at the figures on the page, the numbers refused to change. "We can't keep postponing decisions," she said quietly. "The estate has obligations." No one argued with her. Frank certainly did not. He had spent enough years raising children and paying mortgages to know that good memories could not erase unpaid bills. "You're right," he answered gently. "Responsibility doesn't disappear because something is meaningful." Helen looked from her granddaughter to the familiar workshop walls. "Your grandfather always said a person could love something deeply and still have to make difficult choices." Ashley nodded, grateful that her grandmother understood. "I'm not trying to erase Grandpa," she whispered. "I'm trying to keep the family from falling into worse trouble." Frank walked to the old pegboard and carefully lifted a worn framing square engraved with faded initials. Sam used this with a young man who had just come home after military service, he said. The fellow couldn't sleep well anymore. His hands shook so badly he thought he'd never work with wood. Frank smiled faintly. Sam didn't tell him to stop shaking. He taught him how to keep measuring anyway. He returned the square to its hook. "Every tool here reminds me of someone who believed they were no longer useful." Around the room, several former apprentices quietly nodded. One admitted he had learned carpentry after losing his factory job. Another said the workshop gave him purpose after retiring earlier than expected because of an injury. A widow described how Samuel patiently taught her to repair her own porch steps after her husband passed away, refusing to let her believe she was helpless. Their stories settled over the room like sawdust in afternoon sunlight. Still, the practical questions remained. The appraiser cleared his throat respectfully. The workshop has extraordinary sentimental value, he said. But sentiment doesn't automatically determine what happens to the property. His words were careful, not cold. They simply reflected reality. Helen slowly crossed the room to Samuel's old workbench. She ran her fingertips across countless tiny scratches left by decades of careful labor. "Do you know what my husband loved most about this place?" she asked softly. Everyone turned toward her. It wasn't the furniture he repaired. She smiled through quiet tears. It was watching someone leave, believing they could fix the next thing without him. Ashley looked around the workshop again. The room suddenly felt different from the clutter she had seen only days earlier. Yet the closing dates, debts, and responsibilities still waited outside these walls. As the gathering began to disperse, Frank quietly locked the red toolbox and placed it back beneath the workbench where Samuel had always kept it. "The tools have told us who they belong to," he said. "Now we still have to decide what belongs to the future." No one answered immediately. For the first time, the family understood that the hardest choice was no longer whether the toolbox mattered. It was whether they could find a way to honor everything it represented, without pretending that real life had stopped asking difficult questions. The following Monday morning, Frank returned to the workshop carrying a small wooden box no larger than a lunch pail. He set it beside Samuel's battered red toolbox without saying a word. Helen recognized it immediately. "I haven't seen that in years," she whispered. Frank smiled. "Sam gave it to me when I finished my first real project." Ashley looked inside. There was no money, no certificate, and no expensive keepsake. Only a simple wooden pencil, a folding ruler worn smooth by years of use, and a small block of pine covered with crooked saw cuts. "That's it?" she asked. Frank nodded. "That's everything." Seeing her confusion, he gently picked up the pine block. Every uneven cut had been carefully dated. Along one edge, Samuel had written in neat pencil, "Frank stopped measuring with fear today." Ashley frowned. "What does that mean?" Frank chuckled softly. "For months, I was terrified of ruining good lumber. I'd measure 5 times and still refuse to make the first cut. Sam finally handed me a scrapboard instead of an expensive one." He smiled at the memory. He said, "Wood can forgive a bad cut. Pride has a harder time. So let's practice on something that isn't afraid to be wrong." Several former apprentices laughed quietly because they had heard similar words. One man remembered being told to build a crooked birdhouse before attempting a straight cabinet. Another recalled Samuel intentionally giving beginners dull-looking scrapboards while keeping the finest walnut untouched until they trusted their own hands. Ashley looked back toward the red toolbox. So the engravings, Frank finished her sentence, were never about ownership. He reached inside the toolbox and lifted a well-worn marking gauge engraved with the initials AW. When someone believed these letters meant the tool belonged to them, Sam knew they weren't ready. He gently turned the handle in his hands. When they realized the initials meant they were responsible for helping the next beginner, then they'd earned them. Helen smiled softly. He never wanted anyone collecting tools. Exactly, Frank replied. He wanted people collecting confidence. He walked toward an old pegboard where dozens of empty hooks still waited. Sam could have carved his own initials into every handle. Instead, he chose to fill his workshop with reminders that a craft only stays alive if someone passes it forward. Ashley slowly picked up a small wooden mallet engraved with faded letters she did not recognize. How many people learned here? She asked. Frank looked around the room before answering. Honestly, I stopped counting somewhere after 100. The number settled over everyone in silence. 100 people, 100 families, 100 lives touched by afternoons spent inside this ordinary workshop. Helen quietly opened one of Samuel's old workbench drawers. Instead of receipts or business records, she found stacks of carefully sharpened carpenter's pencils bundled together with simple rubber bands. On the top bundle lay a handwritten note in Samuel's familiar handwriting. Always keep enough pencils for the next person who thinks they can't learn. Ashley smiled through gathering tears. It was exactly the sort of thing her grandfather would have written. Not dramatic, not sentimental, simply practical kindness disguised as ordinary preparation. As more neighbors wandered into the workshop throughout the day, they no longer began by asking which tools were valuable. They asked whose initials they recognized. Every engraving unlocked another story. Every story revealed another person who had first arrived believing they were only there to repair a chair, a porch, or a broken toy, only to leave having repaired something much harder to see inside themselves. By evening, Ashley closed the toolbox with far gentler hands than she had only a week earlier. She finally understood why Samuel had never engraved his own name. He had never believed the workshop existed to remember the carpenter. It existed to remember the people who discovered, one tool at a time, that they were capable of building far more than wood. 2 days later, the auction company returned with packing crates and inventory sheets. Their schedule had not changed, simply because the workshop had become filled with memories. One employee carefully measured the workbenches while another photographed the shelves for the catalog. Bright numbered tags appeared once again on cabinets, clamps, and tool racks. The red toolbox remained on Samuel's workbench, waiting quietly while the room around it prepared for another chapter. Helen watched from the doorway without resentment. She had lived long enough to know that good people could find themselves standing on opposite sides of painful decisions without either side becoming the enemy. Ashley met the auction manager near the front porch and signed the authorization, allowing preparations to continue. Her hand hesitated for only a moment before the pen touched the paper. She looked toward the workshop window, where Frank was showing a neighborhood teenager how to sharpen an old chisel. "I wish there were another way," she admitted. The manager answered gently. "Sometimes there isn't." She nodded, though the words brought her little comfort. Later that afternoon, Frank gathered several former apprentices inside the workshop. None of them came to protest the sale. Instead, they quietly continued repairing a small oak bench that would be donated to the public library. They worked with calm concentration, passing tools from one pair of hands to another, just as Samuel had taught them years before. The workshop sounded alive again, not because of arguments, but because of sandpaper, hand planes, quiet laughter, and patient instruction. Ashley stood unnoticed for several minutes, watching an elderly man teach a younger veteran how to fit a loose joint without forcing it. No one hurried him. No one mocked his mistakes. Every correction sounded strangely familiar. Take your time. Measure again. The wood isn't fighting you. She suddenly realized she was hearing her grandfather's voice through people who had once been his students. As evening approached, Helen brewed a pot of coffee and carried mugs into the workshop. Looking around the room, she smiled softly. "This is the first time since Sam passed that I've heard this place sound like itself." Frank accepted a cup with grateful hands. "Workshops aren't kept alive by buildings," he replied. "They're kept alive by people willing to teach." Ashley looked down at the sale paperwork still folded inside her jacket pocket. "I understand that now," she said quietly. "I just don't know how to make understanding pay the bills." No one offered easy answers because none existed. The debts remained. The estate still required settlement. The property still had to be sold. The truth had become painfully clear. Preserving every board and every wall might not be possible. But preserving what those walls had produced was another question entirely. Before leaving for the evening, Frank opened the red toolbox one more time. Instead of removing a tool, he carefully placed a newly sharpened carpenter's pencil inside. Ashley noticed the simple gesture. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Frank smiled. "Sam always kept one unused pencil in the box." "For what?" Frank gently closed the lid. "For the next person who walked through the door believing they couldn't build anything." Ashley rested her hand on the weathered metal handle. For the first time since discussing the estate, she no longer feared that selling the property meant losing her grandfather forever. The workshop had already begun teaching its next generation. The real question was whether the family would have the courage to keep that lesson alive after the building itself belonged to someone else. Ashley arrived at the workshop before sunrise on the morning before the property closing. For the first time in years, she unlocked the old side door herself. The room greeted her with the familiar scent of cedar, machine oil, and sawdust that had somehow survived every season since her grandfather passed away. She walked slowly past the workbench until she reached the battered red toolbox. For a long moment, she simply rested her hand on the cool metal lid. Then she opened it. She was not searching for hidden money anymore. She was searching for him. One by one, she lifted the familiar tools Frank had shown everyone during the past week. Hammers, chisels, squares, planes. Then, tucked neatly beneath a folding ruler, she found a tiny wooden carving knife no longer than her hand. Unlike the larger tools, its handle carried unusually fresh-looking initials compared to the others. A.C. Ashley Carter. She froze. "That can't be," she whispered. Helen, who had quietly entered behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiled softly. "I wondered when you'd notice it." Ashley looked back at her grandmother in surprise. "Grandpa engraved my initials?" Helen nodded. "The day you finished your first birdhouse." Memories she had not visited in almost 20 years suddenly returned with startling clarity. She was 9 years old, frustrated because every nail bent sideways. After nearly an hour of failed attempts, she had burst into tears and declared she would never build anything as well as Grandpa. Samuel had not taken the hammer away. He had simply handed her the small carving knife and a scrap piece of pine. "Before you build something that lasts," he had told her, "you should learn that every piece of wood already has something beautiful inside it. Your job isn't to force it out. It's to uncover it patiently." Ashley remembered spending the entire afternoon carving crooked little stars into the soft pine while her grandfather quietly worked beside her without correcting every mistake. When she finally finished the birdhouse several weeks later, she had forgotten all about the carving knife. Samuel never had. Helen reached into a nearby cabinet and carefully removed a small, dusty birdhouse with faded blue paint around the roof. One side leaned slightly because Ashley's measurements as a child had not been perfect. "He kept it," Ashley whispered. "He kept every apprentice's first project," Helen replied. Ashley turned the birdhouse over. On the bottom, written in Samuel's careful handwriting, were simple words she had never seen before. Ashley stopped believing mistakes decide the ending. Tears rolled freely down her face. All week she had listened to stories about strangers finding confidence in this workshop. She never imagined she had been one of them. She had spent years believing her grandfather left behind only tools and unfinished projects. In truth, he had quietly left behind a better version of the little girl who once learned that failure was not something to hide from, but something to shape with patient hands. Frank arrived a few minutes later and found Ashley sitting silently at the workbench with the carving knife in one hand and the crooked birdhouse in the other. He understood immediately. Without saying a word, he opened the toolbox and gently placed the little carving knife back in its proper place. "Now you know why Sam never engraved his own initials," he said softly. Ashley nodded through her tears. "Because this workshop was never about proving what he could build. Frank smiled. No. He looked around the quiet room one last time. It was always about helping someone else believe they could build something too. The property closing took place on a quiet Friday morning at the county attorney's office. Every document was reviewed, every signature witnessed, and every legal requirement completed exactly as it should have been. The sale moved forward because the family's financial responsibilities were real and no one pretended otherwise. Yet, before the keys officially changed hands, the new owner made one request. "I'd like to stop at the workshop one last time," he said. By early afternoon, the familiar room was filled again, not with bidders or appraisers, but with people carrying pieces of Samuel Carter's legacy. Michael Collins arrived with the restored rocking chair. The retired teacher brought the little school desk Samuel had helped rebuild after the flood. A local pastor carried a section of an old church pew that had been repaired so skillfully decades earlier that no one could find the original crack anymore. A young father rolled in a handmade cradle where all three of his children had slept, explaining that Samuel had taught his own father to build it before he was born. Then a veteran carefully unfolded photographs of wheelchair ramps built across Oak Ridge over nearly 30 years. "I helped build the first one with Sam," he said quietly. "After that, every person who learned in this workshop helped build the next." Frank stood beside the red toolbox and began lifting the engraved tools one by one. He never described them by their size or purpose. Instead, he spoke the names attached to their handles. Michael Collins. The rocking chair was placed beside the workbench. Dorothy Turner. The restored library shelves appeared in an old photograph. Alan Whitmore. A handcrafted dining table built after losing his factory job. Rebecca Ellis. A toy chest made for foster children. Each tool was connected to a life, and each life was connected to someone who had gone on to teach another person. The workshop slowly transformed into something no appraisal could have measured. It was not a collection of old equipment. It was a living family tree built from patience, skill, and quiet encouragement. Ashley stepped forward, carrying the small blue birdhouse her grandfather had saved all those years. She placed it gently beside the toolbox. "This was the first thing I ever built," she said. "I used to think Grandpa kept it because he loved me. Now I know he kept it because he believed people should never forget where their confidence began." Helen smiled softly, watching three generations stand together around the scarred workbench. The new owner listened to every story before finally speaking. "When I bought this property, I believed I was purchasing land, a house, and a workshop." He looked around the room, filled with repaired furniture, handmade keepsakes, engraved tools, and grateful neighbors. "Now I understand this workshop has never belonged to one family alone. It has belonged to every person who walked out that door, believing they were more capable than when they walked in." He reached into his folder and removed a signed partnership agreement. The family would retain Samuel's red toolbox, every engraved hand tool, and the original workbench. The remaining workshop space would be preserved through a community partnership, allowing local volunteers to continue teaching repair skills, woodworking, and home maintenance to anyone willing to learn. The building would serve a new purpose, but its heart would remain unchanged. No hidden compartment had been opened. No forgotten document had rescued the property. The true inheritance had arrived through worn tool handles, repaired furniture, grateful voices, and living hands that proved Samuel Carter had spent a lifetime building something stronger than wood. He had built people who knew how to help the next person believe in themselves. By the following spring, the old workshop behind the Carter house sounded alive again. The property had changed ownership exactly as the closing agreement required, but every Saturday morning, the doors opened to neighbors, grandparents, teenagers, veterans, and children who wanted to learn how to repair something with their own hands. The new community partnership kept its promise. The original workbench remained in its familiar place. Samuel's battered red toolbox rested at its center, opened only during lessons, never as a museum display, but as a working reminder that tools are meant to serve people, not gather dust. Helen visited every Thursday, just as she always had. She still dusted the shelves, but now she smiled as fresh fingerprints appeared on the workbench by the weekend. Frank taught the first beginner's class, and before anyone picked up a hammer, he handed each student a sharpened carpenter's pencil. Around here, he would say with a gentle smile, we don't start by building furniture. We start by believing you can learn. Ashley became one of the program's most faithful volunteers. The granddaughter, who had once measured the workshop by auction prices, now welcomed every nervous newcomer through the same side door where she had once walked in searching for money. On the first day of every class, she placed her crooked blue birdhouse on a nearby shelf. When someone apologized for making a mistake, she would quietly point to it and say, the person who taught me believed imperfect beginnings deserved to be kept. Before long, the workshop became known throughout Oak Ridge as the place where broken chairs, loose cabinets, and worn toys were repaired free of charge whenever possible. More importantly, it became the place where lonely widowers found purpose again. Retired mechanics became patient teachers. Young parents learned practical skills, and children discovered the quiet satisfaction of making something with care instead of throwing it away. One afternoon, a little boy carefully picked up the old carving knife engraved with Ashley's initials. He looked up and asked, will my name ever be on one of these? Ashley smiled and gently shook her head. Not because you used the tool, she answered. Only because one day you'll help someone else believe they can. Across the room, Helen rested her hand on the worn red toolbox. For just a moment, she could almost picture Samuel standing at the workbench with sawdust on his sleeves, smiling that quiet smile he always wore whenever another student finally trusted their own hands. She realized then that her husband had left behind exactly the inheritance he intended. Not money, not possessions, but people who would continue building confidence long after every board they cut had grown old. If this story reminded you of someone who taught you more by patient example than by words, leave a small heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about dignity, family, and second chances.